Hello, my friends. President Trump is flying to Davos. There will almost certainly be a speech from him and a round of meetings. The Greenland crisis remains underway. Yesterday, Trump gave another one of those remarkable press conferences. He projected that something large is being prepared, while actually saying very little that could be pinned down. One point did stand out, however. He refused to be drawn on security guarantees for Ukraine. I saw an article in the U.S. media earlier today, written by people connected to Ukraine, arguing that the United States appears to have lost interest in the Ukraine conflict. The authors even claimed this is, in some respects, good for Ukraine because they no longer have to waste time rebutting the periodic peace initiatives Trump floats. But that is a superficial comfort. In the only respect that actually matters, the ability to continue the war, Ukrainian dependence on the United States is absolute. Ukraine cannot realistically continue without U.S. backing. If the United States has truly lost interest, then for Ukraine this is not mixed news. It is unequivocally bad. It is fashionable to pretend otherwise, to talk about Ukraine being self-sufficient or to suggest that Europe can replace America. That is fantasy. U.S. military support, U.S. intelligence support, supplies of Patriot interceptors, even Patriots routed through third parties, have been central to Ukraine's ability to stay in the fight at all. Strip that away and the war changes immediately. So yes, Ukraine may be tired of managing Trump's political theatrics, but that is not the same thing as surviving without American power. Now, Davos is coming. Trump is en route. Zelensky indicated yesterday that he is not proposing to go, saying Russian missile attacks and the energy crisis in Kyiv oblige him to remain. This is very uncharacteristic of Zelensky. If he really skips Davos, the reason is almost certainly political, not logistical. Either he does not want to meet Trump because he fears what Trump may say, or, more likely, Trump does not want to meet him, and Zelensky does not want to suffer the humiliation of being openly turned away. So the Davos meeting will proceed. There is anxiety and worry over Greenland. Financial markets are uneasy. Europeans are frantic, improvising, hand-wringing, reacting. Many European states are refusing to join a proposed Gaza peace board, which some are describing as Trump's envisioned alternative to the United Nations. Everything is in flux. And because Trump has not yet spoken in a way that clarifies the direction of his policy, I will defer a detailed discussion of Davos and Greenland until the next program, when there is more clarity. But I will say this about Davos: how times have changed. 4 years ago, at the Munich Security Conference in February 2022, I remember the collective West in full pomp. I remember the fiery speeches denouncing Putin and talking incessantly about an imminent Russian invasion of Ukraine. I remember the confident declarations that the West would remain united in the face of Russian aggression. I have said before, and I repeat it now, many of the participants in Munich in February 2022 looked like they were enjoying themselves. Some seemed delirious with excitement at the prospect of the conflict to come and at the prospect of the massive sanctions they were preparing. Sanctions they were certain would wreck the Russian economy and precipitate a political crisis. In Moscow, 4 years later, there is again talk of a possible invasion of a European country. But now the invader being discussed is the United States, and the supposed victims are Greenland and Denmark. There is plenty of excitement in the air because the stakes are immense, but the euphoria is gone. In its place, there is fear, gloom, and despair. Prime Minister Starmer's attempts to manage, soften, or ameliorate the situation appear to be drawing increasingly ferocious responses from Trump and from Trump's officials. There have been comments attributed to Scott Bessent, the U.S. Treasury Secretary, insisting again that Greenland must be part of the United States. The mood is the reverse of Munich 2022. In Munich there was triumphalism. Now there is dread. It is extraordinary how fast history turns, and we will soon see how real this change is after the speeches, comments, and meetings that take place today and tomorrow. For today, I am going to focus on Ukraine. Before I do, I want to briefly mention a very interesting article by Gordon Hahn, who was kind enough to refer to me as perspicacious, for which I am grateful. I also think Hahn is one of the most perceptive commentators on the Ukraine crisis. The article is on his Substack and is titled Putin's New Hard Line. In it, Hahn pushes back against suggestions that Putin and the Russians have hardened their position in recent weeks, especially after the drone attack on Valdai. Hahn says he has not noticed any major change in Russia's stated position. He has not noticed much change in the speech Putin gave to ambassadors presenting credentials. Hahn argues too much time is wasted parsing diplomatic nuance. He says not enough time is spent on the military developments. On that, Hahn is right. People in the West love to obsess over atmospherics and wordplay, while the battlefield reality steadily grinds forward. Han also says that even in the military developments, though we see a steady ramp up by the Russians, increasing effort, increasing power being exerted against Ukraine, this is not necessarily evidence of a new hardline, but rather the continuation of a methodical, systematic strategy. Step up pressure, degrade capability, destroy the Ukrainian army's warfighting capacity. I agree with much of that, but where I differ is on what the Russians themselves have signaled, particularly to the Americans, in the wake of the Valdai attack. Han's final paragraph is worth capturing in essence. He does not see an inordinate escalation or a new hardline emanating from Moscow. He sees a continuation of Putin's methodical strategy aimed at destroying the Ukrainian army, its warfighting capacity, and the configuration of the current Maidan regime, which persists in rejecting accommodation with Moscow at the West's behest. Han urges readers to focus on the systematic continuity. I urge people to read his piece for themselves and compare it with what I have been saying. Now, what do I say about this? The first rule in all of this is to go back to what the Russians themselves have said. After the drone attack on Valdai, in the Novgorod region, there was a telephone call between Trump and Putin. That call had been arranged in advance. The purpose, according to the Russians, was for Trump to inform Putin about Trump's meeting with Zelensky only hours earlier. Trump, again according to the Russian account, told Putin he had impressed on Zelensky and the Ukrainians that there was no possibility of an interim ceasefire. Zelensky and Kyiv needed to forget about a ceasefire and instead focus on a final settlement. The Russians said they were pleased to hear that even though there were many aspects of the U.S.-Ukrainian diplomatic discussion they did not like, and even though, in their view, little substantive progress had been achieved. The Russian description of this conversation was provided by Putin's foreign policy advisor Yuri Ushakov. The essential message was, Trump told Zelensky to stop treating a temporary ceasefire as a cover, stop trying to secure rest for the armed forces, and instead work toward a comprehensive agreement that ends the war. Ushakov said that Trump reported certain results achieved by Zelensky's team in this direction, but Moscow assessed those results still leave room for Kyiv to interpret, evade, and avoid fulfilling commitments. In other words, Moscow gave Trump a B-. We like that you said certain things, but we're not seeing reliable delivery. Then Ushakov added something far more significant. Putin, Ushakov said, drew Trump's attention to the fact that practically immediately after what the U.S. side considered a successful round of talks at Mar-a-Lago, the Kyiv regime carried out an attack involving a barrage of long-range unmanned aerial vehicles, an attack on the state residence of the President of Russia in the Novgorod region, Valdai. Ushakov then described Trump as shocked by the attack. And then came the line that matters. Ushakov said Putin emphasized Russia intends to continue close and productive work with U.S. partners to search for ways to achieve peace. However, and this is the hinge, with regard to a number of agreements reached at the previous stage and the newly outlined solutions, Russia's position will be revised. Ushakov said this was stated very clearly, and Americans should treat it with understanding. Since Kyiv is using state terrorism, Russia cannot act otherwise. Those words, Russia's position will be revised, are not ambiguous. In ordinary language, in diplomatic language, in any language that is not deliberately evasive, this signals a hardening of the Russian stance. And Ushakov presented this as a message Putin delivered to Trump during the call of 29 December 2025. Now, there is an additional complication, and it is one I feel obliged to state fairly. The Russians keep hinting that in earlier talks, Anchorage and elsewhere, they made certain concessions to the Americans and Ukrainians. I have found it very difficult to identify what those concessions actually were. Because in every public statement by Russian officials, Lavrov, Putin, others since those earlier talks, they have repeatedly reiterated the same core terms Putin outlined in his address to the Russian Foreign Ministry on 14 June 2024. I have not seen Moscow retreat from those terms. There was a brief flurry of reports that Russia told the Americans it would accept a ceasefire in Kherson and Zaporizhia if Ukrainian forces withdrew from Donbas. But subsequent Russian statements have cast doubt on that. And if you look at the battlefield evolution, especially Russia's apparent prioritization of operations in the Zaporizhia direction, it does not look as if Moscow is thinking in terms of freezing those regions. Russia continues to speak of returning Kherson and Zaporizhia in full, including the cities. So I am not sure what these concessions were in concrete terms, but bracket that uncertainty. The key point remains. Ushakov's public account of the Trump-Putin call on 29 December says Russia will revise its position because of Valdai, specifically with regard to prior agreements and newly outlined solutions. That reads like a warning. Whatever understandings you thought existed are now being rewritten. Then we look at Putin's own words, particularly in his speech to ambassadors. Putin spoke again about NATO expansion, about how it proceeded disregarding Russia's objections and in breach of promises made at the end of the Soviet period. Then he said Russia had repeatedly proposed initiatives for a new, reliable, fair architecture of European and global security. Russia proposed rational solutions that could satisfy everyone, America, Europe, Asia, across the world. And then he said it would be worthwhile to return to substantive discussion of those proposals to establish the conditions under which a peaceful settlement in Ukraine could be achieved, and the sooner the better. To me, the natural meaning is straightforward. Russia is now linking a peace settlement in Ukraine to broader negotiations on a security architecture primarily European, but with global implications. The last time Russia made detailed proposals of that kind was in December 2021, the two draft treaties. Those were fundamentally about NATO expansion and about rolling back military infrastructure and deployments to earlier positions. And here is why this matters. Russia has spoken about security architecture before, but not so directly as a condition tied to the Ukraine settlement. Combined with Ushakov's account of Putin telling Trump that Russia will revise its position, it looks to me as if Moscow is signaling a new baseline. Focusing only on Ukraine is no longer sufficient. The wider architecture must be on the table. In his comments to ambassadors, Putin also made clear he wants those negotiations to begin as soon as possible. Now, I will say openly that I was and remain skeptical that the U.S. Senate, in its current configuration, would ever approve a treaty that effectively dismantles NATO's military infrastructure in Eastern Europe and withdraws it to 1,998 positions. I thought it inconceivable on 29 December. But since then we have had the Greenland crisis, and suddenly discussions of NATO fracture, even NATO collapse, are everywhere. Europeans have spoken about closing American bases in Europe as retaliation if the U.S. seizes Greenland. There is talk of an American invasion of Greenland being the death of NATO. Meanwhile, the Americans have been quietly pulling back some infrastructure from Eastern Europe. Forces have reportedly been pulled back from Romania, and there are reports still to be fully confirmed that U.S. involvement is being scaled down in certain NATO structures. What looked impossible now looks, at least marginally, more imaginable. Let me engage in imagination not because I believe it will happen, but because the world has entered a phase where previously unthinkable scenarios are being casually discussed. If, over the next days, weeks, or months, there were an American invasion of Greenland, the United States has the capability to do it. The Europeans do not. When Germany deployed troops in Greenland in support of Denmark, and Trump signaled displeasure, Germany practically scuttled back within a day, claiming their forces were not adapted to the weather conditions. That is the level of European seriousness. So suppose there is a crisis and a rupture in NATO. Might that open political space for negotiation with Russia on the security architecture in Europe? Might U.S. priorities shift into a bargain framework, North Atlantic secured on U.S. terms, Ukraine wrapped up, and then a new set of arrangements with Moscow? I am not asserting this is achievable. I am saying it has become thinkable in a way it was not a month ago. Some people will go further and suggest Greenland is, in effect, about creating the space for negotiating a new European security architecture with Russia. I do not believe that. Trump has talked about Greenland for years, dating back to 2019. I do not think this is some elaborate chess move designed to restructure Europe. But we are living through extraordinary times, and it is at least a thought worth placing on the table, precisely because the external conditions that once made such discussions impossible are now destabilizing. At the same time, uncertainties are everywhere. There is no clarity yet from Moscow about timings, about visits, about what is being brought, about which plans are real and which are noise. There is an enormous cluster of diplomatic initiatives, rumors, and positioning. I agree with Han that too much time can be wasted on diplomatic atmospherics. But diplomacy matters when it signals a shift in baseline assumptions. And the Russian baseline appears to be shifting, not necessarily in the sense of emotional escalation, but in the sense of attaching Ukraine to the wider architecture. Now, there is another article that has attracted attention, an article by Seymour Hersh titled Putin's Long War. I found it deeply disturbing not because it is persuasive, but because of the psychological and political work it appears to be doing. Hersh relays claims from an unnamed U.S. official that the American intelligence community believes Russia is on the ropes, that its army is near collapse, that its economy is near collapse, and that Putin is prosecuting the war out of fanaticism and obsession. Hersh suggests U.S. officials are baffled why Putin rejected a favorable offer from Trump in the autumn, an offer that would have frozen the conflict along existing lines. I do not recognize this picture of Russia at all, neither in the economic data nor in the battlefield reality. In fact, even the Ukrainian commander-in-chief has recently given an interview acknowledging Russia's advantages, Russia recruiting large numbers, having substantial reserves, having decisive advantage in the war in the sky, and being ahead in fiber optic drone capabilities. Ukrainian cities are in blackout, Russian ones are not. That is not a portrait of a collapsing military. Hersh includes an alleged quote, attributed to General Valery Gerasimov, Russia's chief of the general staff, claims about having no longer an army, tanks and armored vehicles being junk, artillery barrels worn out, supplies intermittent, mid-grade officers dead, rank and file being ex-convicts. This does not resemble any reality visible to anyone who follows the war daily, Russian, Ukrainian, or Western. And it raises an obvious question. If Gerasimov said this, to whom did he say it? When? Where? In what context? Gerasimov has been visible in recent months. There is film material of him briefing Putin and receiving briefings from commanders. The public-facing Gerasimov does not speak or behave like a man presiding over total collapse. He conveys growing confidence and an army advancing steadily. Of course, someone can always claim he speaks differently in private, but the dissonance required here is extreme. To act with conviction, give operational direction at command headquarters, and behave as if victory is unfolding while privately believing everything is rubble and rot. I cannot accept that at face value. For a time, I wondered whether this stream of claims was designed to create trouble between Putin and Gerasimov, an attempted wedge, a manufactured narrative. If so, it has failed. Every sign indicates Gerasimov retains Putin's confidence. But what truly disturbed me is not merely the false battlefield portrait. It is the insinuations layered into the text, talk of change at the top, references to killing revolution, the ghost in the Kremlin closet, and a hole of violence growing deeper. The thrust reads like psychological conditioning, preparing audiences to see Putin's forcible removal as desirable, even necessary. And all of this is wrapped around anger and frustration that Putin refuses to accept American terms for ending the war, meaning, in practice, freezing it along current lines. That is why it is disturbing, not because it tells the truth, but because it signals a certain kind of desperation, a desire to force an end state on Russia that Russia will not accept. And it lands in a context that makes it darker, the Valdai drone attack, which Russia framed as an attempted assassination attempt against Putin's residence. The same general ecosystem in U.S. media has recently featured reports in which U.S. intelligence services effectively acknowledge involvement in Ukraine's drone campaign against Russia. Whether or not one accepts every Russian claim, the pattern is plain. Escalation in unconventional pressure, coupled with narrative work that frames leadership decapitation as a rational solution. I am going to be careful here. I do not know who the U.S. official speaking to Hersh is. I do not know how representative he is. Much of what he says appears demonstrably untrue. The alleged Gerasimov quote looks like fantasy, but the framing revolution, removal, violence combined with frustration at Putin's refusal to freeze the war on American terms reads uncomfortably like groundwork being laid for justifying future escalation against Russia's leadership. And if that is how it reads to me, it is how it will read in Moscow.